Syria's warring sides take a step toward peace. Representatives from the regime and opposition are in Geneva to begin writing new rules for governing the country. Could this be the breakthrough that ends the brutal war? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the drafting of Syria's new constitution. After years of false starts and deadlock, the Syrian regime and the opposition have begun the process of drafting a new constitution for the country. It's a leap forward in a process that began back in 2018 after negotiators in Sochi agreed to form a constitutional committee. It took a year for UN Chief Antonio Guterres to declare that the body had been established, and many hoped it would mark the beginning of the end of the war.
I am pleased to announce the agreement of the government of the Syrian Arab Republic and the Syrian Negotiations Commission for a credible, balanced and inclusive constitutional committee that will be facilitated by the United Nations in Geneva. I welcome the progress made by the government and the opposition, and my special envoy facilitated the agreement in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254 of 215, and will convene the Constitutional Committee in the coming weeks.
But over the following 2 years, very little was achieved. The committee is made up of 45 members, 15 from the Assad regime, 15 from the opposition, and 15 from civil society groups. But they met just 5 times in 24 months. And even when they did, they couldn't agree on much. Following their meeting in January of this year, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, Spokesperson, expressed his frustration at the lack of progress.
This is not a debating committee. You can continue debating forever. We need to move this into in a manner where the members themselves start to identify areas where they agree or disagree, and then move into the drafting phase. And this is what is missing for the time being.
The war went on, and Assad even held an election in May, winning more than 95% of the vote. The opposition called the poll a sham, a view shared by the West. But on Sunday, the UN announced real potential progress. For the first time, the regime and the opposition co-chairs agreed to start the process of drafting provisions for constitutional reform. Pedersen, the UN's Syria envoy, who'd been frustrated for so long, was finally delighted.
And I'm very pleased to say that we have reached such a consensus. And the two co-chairs now agree that we will not only prepare for constitutional reform, but we will prepare and start drafting for constitutional reform. So the new thing this week is that we will actually be starting a drafting process for constitutional reform in Syria.
Well, to get to this moment has taken years of negotiation, but Syrians have been suffering for much longer. More than 10 years of war has killed hundreds of thousands, pushed more than 13.5 million into abject poverty, and forced more than 5.5 million to flee abroad. But while the UN celebrates this latest breakthrough, many remain cautious, and this is why. Small pockets of northwestern Syria are controlled by the opposition with the support of Turkish forces. In the northeast, the YPG holds a significant portion of territory, but 2/3 of the country is in the hands of the Assad regime. So if Assad controls the majority of Syria, what's in it for him? Is the regime really interested in constitutional reform and power sharing? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined now from Strasbourg by Yahya al Aridi, a member of the Syrian Constitutional Committee and spokesperson for the opposition's Syrian Negotiations Commission. From Oxford is Ibrahim Olabi, a lawyer at Guernica 37 and member of the board of the Syrian British Council. And Scott Lucas is an international politics professor at the University of Birmingham. Thanks all so much for being with me. Ibrahim Olabi, I'll start with you. Are we overselling this by describing it, this step in drafting a constitution, as a leap forward? Because you seem to be managing expectations at best.
Absolutely, and it's not me who's managing expectations. It's the last 10 years of the Syrian conflict and the way the regime has dealt with this. So the Security Council Resolution 2254, which Russia, by the way, agreed to along with China by not putting a veto in, talks about one element of the political solution being the Constitutional Committee, but there are many elements, including a transitional body and so on, that are completely ignored. And the risk that we're facing when we talk about the Constitutional Committee being a step towards the end of the conflict. Which conflict are we talking about? Because militarily things are relatively calm, but Syria is a fragile state. It's a split state between different parties of control, and a constitution would not sort out this problem. But what this committee is, or what this process helps us to do, is one, expose that the regime is not willing to do any sort of political concessions, no matter how minor they are, because they know the moment they concede on any point, it's a slippery slope from there. It's a place to show the good faith of willing to engage on any sort of political process by other actors, and it's a step towards sort of the political solution, but it is not the political solution. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians did not die because of an article in the constitution, nor were the chemical weapons that were used against Syrians by the Assad regime authorized by the constitution. So definitely not a constitutional problem, and definitely not a solution to the conflict.
Okay. Scott Lucas, are you any more optimistic about this process than Ibrahim is?
I will say I'm realistic. Make of that what you may. I think what I would add to Ibrahim's excellent comments are that a constitution is a document. Now, I favor a document that brings equal rights for Syrians, that brings reforms, but a document must have processes, institutions, and systems. And there are two immediate issues here. The first is that very few politicians ever like to give up power. And in Syria, we have an Assad regime with Bashar al-Assad, his family, and their inner circle, who have ruled the country for more than half a century. So what will the implementation of this constitution be to open up the system where it is not an Assad regime for the next 50 years? Which leads to the second part of this, which is we're not just talking about Bashar al-Assad and his family and his friends and his allies. We're talking about every Syrian institution which is under the control of that very narrow rule. Syria's parliament is just an outgrowth of the Assads. Syria's judicial system is under their control. Even the mosque in Syria in some way is controlled by this family and its networks. Syria's economy, of course, controlled by the Assad and their network who profit from this, and of course, the military and the state security systems. Let's go back to the fundamental. It's always been envisaged that Bashar al-Assad one day would peacefully step aside from power. How do we get from a constitution to that point if the majority of Syrians believe that he should no longer be president?
Right. Is it fair to ask, Scott, I mean, how do you negotiate a constitution if you can't yet even negotiate the peace?
Well, you can negotiate principles that we would hope that all Syrians could live by and aspire to. But even in the story of the Constitutional Committee, which was first announced almost 4 years ago, which has met for almost 2 years, there's been a sticking point. And that is you have an opposition and you have the civil society groups who make up 2/3 of the members who come in and say, let's talk about the fundamental political, social, and legal rights. And the Assad regime's line is, no. Our two priorities are this. 1, sovereignty, and 2, terrorism. It's catch-all term for anyone who opposes Assad.
Right.
And the question is, how does the Constitution lay down fundamental rights instead of getting diverted into the Assad regime's, as it were, garments, which is our anti-terrorism system embodied in our man, Bashar al-Assad, that takes precedence over any rights or reforms that you might wish to invoke.
Scott, I want to get back to that definition of terrorism. But first, let me ask Ibrahim, I mean, we already have, or Syria already has, the Constitution of 2012. It was quite inclusive and democratic on paper. There really arguably wasn't a lot wrong with it as a document, but it has amounted to nothing in practice. So you have to ask the question now, what could whatever is negotiated in this part of the process now actually be forced into practice?
Absolutely. And that's not a question that, funny enough, Assad can answer, because it's a question that his allies can answer. I mean, we've seen that this kind of constitutional round was really triggered by Assad's sudden, unexpected, and secret trip to Moscow, where he met Putin. Next thing we know, Geir Pedersen is calling for a round of talks. And so it's the seriousness of the allies that are willing to put their foot down and force Assad to do this. And Syria was always good, and the Syrian regime was always good in playing the legal jargon terms. We've seen their responses to different kind of UN special procedures, working groups. They answer with pages and pages of legal jargon, citing Syrian law and international law and judicial precedents, which for anyone who's not following the Syrian conflict, is not aware of the regime, might sound like fabulous answers. But there is no separation of power. Assad is in control of everything, as Professor Scott just mentioned, and therefore they're dealing with this situation. Syria is in a bit of an interesting position, right? The regime is, because on one hand they don't want to be seen as a rogue state, right? They don't want to be seen like the North Korean version of the world, where they're just minding their own business, doing their thing, and they don't want to place on the international kind of scene. But at the same time, if they engage with the international community, then all the crimes will be exposed, and they also risk losing issues of sovereignty. So on one hand, they do want to be part of a process, but on the other hand, that also means if they compromise as part of the process, that it's the start of their demise. So it's not an easy situation for Assad either, because any sort of enforceability of whatever is written in paper in Geneva would essentially lead to some sort of transition if it's been seriously negotiated and there was some sort of enforcement mechanism by the allies.
I haven't been ignoring Yahya. We were having a lot of technical difficulties with his line, but he's back now. Yahya al Aridi, thank you for being with us. Glad you're reconnected. Let me ask you this question. How much do you fear, quite simply, that the regime has the upper hand and that delay tactics will get them what they want? Arguably not dissimilar to what the Taliban was able to do in Afghanistan.
Well, to the first part of your question, I think we are not that optimistic, because we know the games of the regime and we know all the tactics of the Russians. They think that the involvement in the political process could open up for the regime so that others would bring back their relationships with the regime, and they would open up to the regime. And I don't think that this could be a source for optimism. We understand that the regime believes only in the military solution and always weasels out and runs away from any political process. This meeting of the Constitutional Committee is possibly promising, based on the fact that there is a new methodology. There are certain principles that need to be agreed upon, and there's an agreement on constitutional reform. If this is the case, then Syria has the chance or a possibility of going back to life. We understand very well that the regime cares about one thing. It is its continuous existence, and at the expense of Syrian blood and Syrian destruction. However, we just deal with things, we approach things in a responsible way. We care about the millions of people who have been displaced.
Okay.
We care about, and we need to write a constitution that is implementable.
Right. Yeah, I just have to address this with you because, as you know, there has been a lot of criticism of the opposition that they've actually just failed, to offer a better, clearer alternative, that could keep Syria united. Is that fair?
Well, at least if we just do a comparison between the regime and those who oppose the regime, at least they are not killers. They didn't use chemical weapons. They didn't displace half of the population of Syria. They didn't destroy Syria. They didn't use barrel bombs or chemical weapons. They didn't invite occupation. This is unfair, unjust for Syrians. Those who are opposing the regime with its oppression are not looking forward to posts and to become leaders or whatever. They want to rescue Syria from the real devastation that was brought up by the regime and Russia and Iran.
Okay, let me ask
This
Ibrahim.
is really part of a campaign being carried out by Russia, by Iran, by the regime, paying millions of dollars in order to smear, in order to destroy the reputation of the opposition that they are no good. No.
Okay.
We don't want the Assad's position. No. We just want Syria to come back to life.
Ibrahim, let me ask you, I mean, should that, in a sense, be good enough? The opposition may have failed in certain respects, but at least it's not Assad. Should that be enough to attract the support of the majority of Syrians?
Well, the whole beautiful thing about when Syrians took it to the streets in 2011 is we don't want to know who's going to replace Assad, right? And when people come and say, well, who's the alternative? The whole idea, the whole opposition to Assad existed of, well, we shouldn't know like we did in over 40 years who's going to come next. Because the whole idea of free and fair elections is that you don't know who will come next. And what we want to, as the person, the characteristics should be people who are not kind of involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity and used chemical weapons against their own people. But again, bringing it back to the Constitutional Committee, this is the Constitutional Committee is not about changing or regime change. We're even seeing kind of more and more kind of language being used by different departments of states and foreign offices talking about behavioral change, right? So it appears that the world has trying to turn a blind eye about the crimes against the laws that it put together, right? We're talking, Syrians did not put the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions and the, Convention against the chemical weapons. It was the world that did that. So switching to kind of talking from changing this brutal regime to kind of changing its behavior, and then conceding that the Constitutional Committee is the political process is, in my opinion, absolute nonsense. And that's something that the Syrian opposition and everyone who opposes Assad, and by the way, the term Syrian opposition encompasses anyone who stands against, the brutality of Assad, organized or not, should stand against. And that's what we're doing.
Okay. Scott, I want to ask you this because Ibrahim had said that he doesn't believe the Assad regime actually wants to function as a rogue state. And I want you to pick up on that because, in a sense, you are dealing with a regime that's used to existing on the fringes. It was listed as an axis of evil power, back in 2002 by the United States and was never properly brought back into the fold of international politics after 2002, more or less. So, I mean, did the U.S. perhaps inadvertently teach the Assad regime how to exist as a rogue state or a pariah state?
No, let's be clear here. It's too easy to say blame the Americans, and I'm not going to play that game. The Assad regime made itself a rogue state, and far more importantly, it put itself beyond the decency of any system or state when it killed hundreds of thousands of its civilians, including through conventional attacks, chemical attacks, abuse, torture in its prisons.
And that's fine, I understand that, but my point was, this regime for 20 years has been on the margins. It's been that rogue state, and it has learned how to function on the margins and exist as a pariah.
Syria,
go ahead.
Yeah. But Syria wasn't a rogue state just before 2011. Remember that Western capitals had put ambassadors back into Syria. Robert Ford, the US ambassador, was there. Peter Ford, who was British ambassador, now works with the Assad regime. He was there. So up to the protest of 2011, amidst all the protests across the Middle East and North Africa, the Assad regime was part of the international community. The question was, how would it respond to those protests? Now, I think to get to your question now in 2021, the immediate catalyst of what is occurring with the Constitutional Committee, the reason why we have seen the Assad regime at least say, all right, we will move towards drafting, is because it wants to normalize relations. Ibrahim mentioned the fact that this comes after President Assad went to Moscow, where President Putin effectively said, look, you need to give the appearance of not being rogue. We need to try to get some type of political advance here. And of course, closer to home, the prospect, indeed, we've already seen it to an extent, of better relations with Jordan on the economic front, of better political relations with Egypt and the UAE. In other words, the Assad regime wants to function first and foremost as a member of the community which makes up the Arab League. They aren't quite there yet, but I suspect rather than having the Constitution as their priority, playing along with the Constitutional Committee as a lever is part of their attempt to get back to some notion of respectability.
Okay. Yahya al Aridi, let me ask from your perspective if you think, is it Russia or is it the Assad regime that is really deciding not just how this negotiation process will be carried out right now, but most of the other major decisions being made on behalf of Syria?
I think the regime is in a state of disarray. At the economic level, the situation in Syria is unbelievable. Socially, the society is fragmented, torn up, in a state of poverty, educationally, etc., etc. Russia is playing a role. Iran is playing the worst role ever. The regime has no say. The head of the regime was shipped to Russia to get diktats from the Russian leader in order to join this political process, the Constitutional Committee, so that things would open up for the regime. And other Arab states, I would say that no more than tools being used in order to just normalize things. And this is all an illusion. The situation inside Syria, even at the bank of the regime itself, you hear videos about people complaining in a horrible way. The regime is not subject to survival.
Ibrahim, I want to move on to something else with you because at this point, the regime has to ensure its own survival, not just politically, but actually avoiding, a fate along the lines of arguably even Saddam Hussein. So what could ever be the options to offer in exchange for Assad potentially stepping down, be it either through resignation or through an election whereby he might lose?
I mean, I'm not here to offer the regime advice as to how to get out of this. But in terms of what we could see happening is, the allies saying enough is enough, right? Saying the cost to the allies, to Russia, to Iran, that, Assad is becoming too much of a burden. So it's really not about what Assad can do to get out of this. It's what the world can do to Russia and Iran, either in terms of carrot or a stick, for them to say, no, it's time for you to go. And that could be in a form of a plane and him just, going somewhere else or other forms of a change of regime. So it's because it's really not about Assad. And anyone who would watch, the videos when Putin came to, the military base in Syria and he was with Assad and some random general just held Assad's hand and held him back from kind of going and standing next to Putin, right? This is happening inside Syria. I'm not an expert in kind of diplomatic kind of ceremonial matters, but that seems to me as Russia super looks down to at Assad. So it's a matter of whether the West wants to do a kind of a Ukraine deal with Russia, or a matter of what happens with the nuclear Iran deal, what it could offer kind of the Gulf or deal with Gulf states with regards to Assad, because it's not in Assad's hand. I mean, from a kind of a legal perspective and a human rights perspective, these crimes never go away, right? They have no statute of limitation. They stay for a very long time. When President Biden was asked about in the press briefing after he met Putin, when he was asked why he doesn't trust Assad, he said because he used chemical weapons, right? So it's something from the past. It's something to show that this is not something that we can kind of get easily over with. So the options are limited, but they're all in the hands of the allies.
Okay, Scott, we're down to our last minutes. Let me get your final thoughts.
I wish I could see a future with Ibrahim where the international community can put pressure on to get this breakthrough, this transition in the near future. I don't think it will happen. I think Russia's too deeply entrenched. They don't like Assad, but they have not got a replacement for Assad. So what happens if the Russians won't back away and the Assad regime effectively stays in power with or without a constitution? I think it's this. We actually don't have one Syria, we've got three Syrias. So while we wait to see what happens with the Assad regime, it's important that in northwest Syria, in which Turkey has an interest, that opposition groups can find a way for governance, their own, in effect, fulfillment of a constitution. And it's important in the northeast, which is largely held under Kurdish authority, that we find a way to governance and stability there. In other words, if all of Syria cannot be delivered back to Syrians, and I regret that cannot happen, at least we need to look for examples beyond Assad where some Syrians can find a way out of the absolute nightmare that they've endured not only for the past decade, but arguably for many decades before that.
Scott Lucas, Ibrahim Olabi, Yahya al Aridi, thank you all so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Great to speak to you all. And thanks to our viewers, as always, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.